When you don't own the system, your rise is a threat, not a celebration. Power is not always threatened by weapons or armies. In the modern world, power is threatened by independence. Independence of thought, of innovation, of economy. So, when a nation like India begins to rise, not just with numbers or population, but with companies that start to shift the center of gravity from west to east, those who created the game begin to see new players not as partners but as competitors, and then from competitors to threats. America has spent decades building a global system of commerce, communication, and compliance. Every wire, every app, every satellite, every standard, it has all been designed to be routed through systems they own, influence, or can interrupt. And when a company from India bypasses that route, builds its own platform, and gains traction in the international marketplace, it is no longer playing the game, it is redefining it. When Indian tech companies build alternatives to Western data systems, when they launch apps that rival Silicon Valley, when they design semiconductors and AI models that don't depend on Western frameworks, they aren't just innovating, they are disrupting. And disruption is not welcome unless it is coming from within the club. The American system rewards innovation when it is contained within its regulatory and ideological framework. But the moment innovation grows outside of that circle, it becomes uncontrollable, unpredictable, and most importantly, unprofitable for those who used to dominate. So the bans are not about security, they are about supremacy, not safety, they are about sovereignty. The moment an Indian company shows that it no longer needs a Silicon Valley server or a New York investment or a Washington stamp of approval, it becomes something else. It becomes a reminder that the old world order is fading and a new one is being written. But when you don't own the media, your narrative can be twisted. When you don't control the courts of global opinion, your progress can be recast as suspicion. Words like data risk, national security threat, compliance violations begin to show up. But these are not conclusions, they are weapons. These terms are often used not after investigations but before, not to solve problems but to create fear. Because fear is a powerful tool, it doesn't need evidence, it only needs headlines. And headlines don't need truth, they only need repetition. So an Indian app that becomes successful in the hands of American consumers suddenly becomes a threat, not because of what it does, but because of where it comes from and who controls it. This is not a technical battle, it's a territorial one. Not a digital issue, it's a dominance issue. See, the global system was never built to be fair. It was built to be followed. And those who created it made sure that the center of power always remained in their orbit. But what happens when a satellite develops its own gravity? What happens when a country doesn't just contribute talent to another's machine, but builds its own engine? The narrative changes from partnership to protectionism. And that's what we see happening. Indian pharmaceutical companies, Indian semiconductor ventures, Indian fintech solutions. They are not being banned because they are weak. They are being banned because they are strong. Too strong to ignore, too independent to control. Because when you don't own the foundation of the system, your success is not considered growth. It's considered rebellion. Think about the psychology of global power. The one who writes the rules always fears those who start writing their own. And India has been writing. Quietly, steadily, rewriting its role in the digital economy, in global manufacturing, in space, in AI, in biotech. But the most revolutionary shift has not been in technology, it has been in confidence. India has stopped asking for seats at the table and started building its own, and that shakes the system, because confidence cannot be colonized. It cannot be licensed. It is born from within. And when a generation of Indian entrepreneurs, engineers, and thinkers begin to act without asking for permission, they reveal something dangerous to the status quo, that global excellence does not require Western validation. Now watch the response. Ban this app, restrict that trade, block that partnership, question that acquisition. But beneath the legal language lies something deeper: insecurity. Insecurity that the monopoly on innovation is ending. Insecurity that the world is no longer one-way traffic, that data doesn't only flow west, that capital doesn't only flow west, that talent doesn't only flow west. For the first time in a century, the direction is changing. And the system, which was built for one-way power, is now confronted by two-way progress. And that makes bans not just acts of protection, but acts of desperation. When you don't own the system, your excellence will be treated as disruption. But that disruption is not failure. It's proof. Proof that you've outgrown the role you were expected to play. Proof that you no longer fit in the box that was designed to keep you dependent. The bans are not setbacks. They are confirmations. Confirmations that the work being done is reshaping the future. The fact that certain companies are targeted, flagged, restricted. It is not a mark of danger, it is a mark of independence. Because power never bans what it can control, it bans what it can't. So the lesson is clear: when you rise in a system you don't own, don't expect applause, expect resistance. When your excellence doesn't require their platform, don't expect partnership, expect policing. And when your progress threatens their monopoly, don't expect an invitation. Expect investigation, but none of that should stop the mission. Because in the end, history does not remember who banned whom. It remembers who built, who lasted, who led. The goal is not to be accepted. It's to be unstoppable. Every economy is a reflection of the philosophy that built it. And behind every successful company, there is not just a balance sheet, but a world view. So when Indian companies begin to rise, not just in their domestic market but across the global stage, it is not just economics being challenged, it is ideology. The global economy, especially the one led by the United States, is not neutral. It has never been neutral. It is a carefully curated ecosystem of influence, protection, and control. When a company earns $1 billion, it's not just business. It's power. And power in the modern world is not always found in governments. Today, power wears a suit, files patents, signs trade deals, owns platforms, and controls information pipelines. When India begins to generate its own economic giants, those giants start to speak, not with press conferences, but with numbers. Every successful Indian company represents something more than revenue. It becomes a vote against dependency. It is a message that says, we don't need to borrow your systems, we are building our own. And in a world where narrative is currency, that kind of message becomes dangerous to the existing balance. That is why you will notice that bans are not applied equally. A data scandal in an American company is treated as an internal hiccup. The same issue in an Indian company is declared a global threat. Why? Because when power senses that its own model of control is being challenged by a rising power, it does not fully understand. It moves to neutralize, not with diplomacy, but with denial of access. India has always been seen as a provider of talent, not as a producer of platforms. The expectation was always that India would send engineers, developers, analysts, workers who would build someone else's dream. But the moment India started to build its own digital platforms, its own AI frameworks, its own global tech infrastructure, the old equation broke. Now the world is looking at Indian CEO not just as employees of Western companies, but as creators of sovereign digital ecosystems. And that is when the shift began. Economic power, when it no longer serves the interests of the dominant political force, becomes a liability in their eyes. They begin to frame your progress as problematic, your reach as reckless, your innovation as infiltration. But make no mistake, what is being restricted is not code, not hardware, not apps. What is being restricted is independence. The independence to think, to trade, to operate, to connect, without running it through someone else's filter. America's bans on Indian companies are not random actions. They are coordinated reminders. Reminders that in their system, your power has limits, that your growth must come with strings attached, that your influence must pass their approvals. But India's new economy is refusing to bow to that framework. It is refusing to wait for validation. It is not asking for inclusion. It is asserting presence, and that is why it is being met with resistance. Because when you realize that economic power translates into political leverage, you start to see the real game. If an Indian payment system begins to dominate across South Asia, it weakens the dollar's grip. If Indian pharma starts delivering cost-effective drugs globally, it undermines monopolies. If Indian cloud services host data independent of American jurisdiction, it breaks surveillance models. Every economic victory becomes a strategic loss for the one who used to hold all the cards. And those who hold the cards don't like to be outplayed. Think of the world like a digital chessboard. The player who controls the platforms controls the game. And the player who controls the payment gateways, the satellite networks, the mobile ecosystems. That player doesn't just have economic reach, they have political influence. That player can shape elections, shape narratives, shape supply chains, shape treaties. So when Indian companies begin to build that level of infrastructure, they don't just become brands. They become potential policymakers, not through parliaments, but through presence. And that is what makes them dangerous to the old system. Not because they are wrong, but because they are effective. Now observe the timing of these bans. They don't come when companies are small. They come when they become successful. They don't come when they launch. They come when they scale. It's never about security. It's about significance. A company that stays in its lane, remains regional, stays dependent, will never face a ban. But a company that begins to shape global markets, that begins to attract Western consumers, that begins to bypass the usual routes, those companies are flagged, watched, targeted, because they are no longer just companies. They are symbols of a shifting power structure. And here is the deeper truth. No one bans what they don't fear. If your platform had no influence, no traction, no reach, why would anyone waste energy trying to block it? The very act of banning is proof of relevance. And when that relevance comes from a country that is no longer willing to play second tier, it becomes a wake-up call. India's economy is no longer waiting for instructions. It is writing its own script. The companies rising from this soil are no longer interested in outsourcing their futures. They are determined to own them. The bans then are not evidence of wrongdoing. They are evidence of right doing. Right strategy, right timing, right ambition. And what America fears in these moments is not failure. It is success that lies outside its influence. That's what makes Indian companies worth banning, not because they are flawed, but because they are free. Free from the need to depend, free from the habit of compromise, free from the psychological grip of validation. And when economic power becomes this kind of freedom, it automatically becomes political. Because the greatest threat to any empire is not another army, it's a thriving idea that refuses to submit, and Indian companies are becoming that idea. They are planting flags not on territories, but on technologies. They are not exporting products, they are exporting confidence. And that confidence cannot be sanctioned, banned, or deleted, because economic power is only the beginning. What it ultimately produces is influence, and influence is the currency of the New World Order. Control has never needed bullets when it has the power of the story. Empires are not sustained by force alone. They are sustained by the ability to shape perception. And in the modern age, the most powerful weapon is not a missile. It is a message. Whoever owns the narrative owns the influence, and whoever owns the influence owns the future. So when Indian companies begin to rise, creating technologies, platforms, and industries that challenge the status quo, the immediate response is not a direct attack, it's a redirection of the story. Control is maintained by creating a narrative of risk, and this is where the true strategy lies. When a nation starts producing competitive alternatives to Western platforms, it starts disrupting more than the market. It disrupts trust. The question is no longer, is this a good product, but is this a safe one? And once that question is inserted into the minds of regulators and the public, the battle is already halfway lost, because safety is subjective and perception is powerful. A product can be clean, legal, and ethical, but if it is framed as a risk, its success will be delayed, denied, or even dismantled. And so, Indian tech companies, pharmaceutical firms, digital apps, and AI models find themselves not in a competition of quality, but in a battlefield of narrative. You will hear words like national security, privacy violations, intellectual property theft, and espionage risk. These are not findings, they are not judgments passed after years of scrutiny. No, these are often the opening lines of a story that is written before the investigation begins. It's not that the product has done something wrong, it's that its existence itself challenges control. A successful Indian data company, for example, isn't just processing information, it's holding influence over knowledge, and that influence threatens the monopoly of those who believe they are the only ones who should store, analyze, and monetize global data. So the moment an Indian company creates an original model, a platform that gains traction, or a network that starts to expand outside its own borders, the story changes. The shift is subtle but strategic. The company is no longer described by what it does but by what it might do. What if it becomes too powerful? What if it is linked to foreign political interests? What if it cannot be monitored by our systems? That what if becomes the basis for regulation, for investigation, for restriction. Suddenly, the public is not asked to evaluate performance but to fear potential, and fear doesn't need logic. It doesn't need evidence. It only needs repetition. The story becomes the sentence. This tactic is not new. It has been used against nations, leaders, and ideas throughout history. The difference now is that it is being used against innovation. When control cannot stop the growth of an idea, it starts painting that idea in colors of danger, and in doing so, it slows adoption, stirs doubt, and fractures trust. Indian companies, instead of being recognized as emerging global leaders, are cast as potential threats, not because of what they have done, but because of where they come from. That geographical origin becomes enough to place suspicion. The birthplace becomes the basis for the ban. The most ironic part of this entire structure is that the very nations banning Indian products on grounds of ethics and transparency are often themselves dealing with internal corruption, surveillance programs, and corporate manipulation. But the power of the narrative allows them to set the terms of judgment. They do not need to be innocent to accuse. They only need to be influential enough to be believed. And when they label a company a risk, the global market listens not because it agrees, but because it fears losing access. This is how control is maintained, not through fairness, but through fear. And the mechanism of fear is built on media echo chambers, legal ambiguity, and bureaucratic overload. By the time an Indian company has cleared its name, the opportunity window has closed. The partnership has been lost, the investment withdrawn, the expansion halted, so the goal of the narrative is not to prove wrongdoing, it is to delay progress, because in the world of technology and global trade, delay is defeat. 1 year of regulatory freezing can cost a startup its entire future. One blocked app can cripple an entire ecosystem of developers, coders, and users. But what this also reveals is the power Indian companies are beginning to hold. Because no one wastes propaganda on irrelevance. If the system is crafting narratives of danger around Indian firms, it means those firms have grown large enough to matter, and that is where the deeper game begins. It's not about banning one app or restricting one export. It's about sending a message. We decide what's safe. We decide what's trusted. We decide who gets to scale. But India is no longer listening in the same way. The younger generation of entrepreneurs is not apologizing for success. They are not shrinking in the face of scrutiny. They are building anyway, they are launching anyway, and they are rewriting the story, not with speeches, but with solutions. The next stage of global growth will not be determined by who shouts the loudest, but by who builds the most resilient systems. And Indian companies, forged under the weight of restrictions and bans, are becoming exactly that resilient. Every block, every ban, every investigation is not a wall, it's a forge. It produces sharper strategies, cleaner governance, more transparent structures. Because when you know you are being watched, you grow not only faster but smarter. Control may try to hold onto the throne through narrative, but the future will not be ruled by those who repeat stories. It will be ruled by those who write new ones. Indian companies must understand that this battle is not about avoiding suspicion. It's about surviving through it, rising despite it, and succeeding because of it. The goal is not to fit into the existing narrative. The goal is to make that narrative obsolete. Control will always try to protect itself. But when the truth is undeniable and the solutions are indispensable, even the strongest narratives begin to collapse. And in that moment, control has no choice but to adapt or be replaced. The greatest fear of any established power is not war, it's irrelevance. And irrelevance begins the moment influence ends. Influence is the invisible thread that ties systems together. It's the power to shape decisions without force, to control direction without ownership, to define standards without negotiation. And when influence starts to weaken, fear takes its place. Not fear of violence or collapse, but fear of losing the ability to predict and control. That's why the global system, especially the one centered in the West, reacts so aggressively when it sees something rising that it cannot influence. Influence is not about domination through power. It's about domination through access. Access to leadership, access to infrastructure, access to data, access to decisions. But when a nation begins to build independent systems, cultivate internal leadership, and control its own future, it cuts off the pathways of influence. India is doing exactly that. And that's why many of its companies are facing bans, scrutiny, and sanctions, not because they are threats in the traditional sense, but because they are outside the sphere of familiar influence. The world doesn't fear what it can shape. It fears what it cannot reach. And Indian companies, for the first time in modern history, are reaching a point where their decision-making, their growth, and their loyalty are not defined by foreign interests. They are building for Indian needs, Indian values, and Indian users first. And when that internal compass becomes strong, external influence begins to fade. That fading influence is what causes discomfort in capitals that are used to being able to pick up the phone and change outcomes. You see, for decades, the global tech ecosystem was centered around Silicon Valley. The platforms, the funding, the algorithms, the app stores, the venture capital. They were all routed through systems that were easily accessible and influenceable by the Western system. Companies that grew in those systems were naturally shaped by the values, biases, and politics of that ecosystem. But India didn't follow the same blueprint. Instead of cloning the West, it started solving for itself. It built platforms like UPI, which bypassed global payment networks. It built Aadhaar, which created a new standard for digital identity. It built its own app ecosystem, its own satellite programs, its own data governance frameworks. That was not just innovation, that was insulation from outside pressure, And this insulation is what draws global fear, not because India is isolating itself, but because India is no longer dependent. It doesn't have to rely on imported platforms to conduct its business. It doesn't need approval from global tech monopolies to roll out national services. It doesn't have to bow to external ratings, rankings, or biases to prove its potential. And this self-reliance creates a vacuum of influence for those who are used to dictating terms. They can no longer leverage their systems to control behavior. They can no longer use dependencies to bend policies. They can no longer use economic incentives to ensure compliance. And when influence is lost, fear is born. This fear manifests not as admission, but as action. The action comes in the form of bans, of restrictions, of regulatory blockades, of national security arguments. The language may be sophisticated, but the motive is simple: regain control. If influence cannot be restored through partnership, it will be reasserted through pressure. If persuasion fails, policing begins. But here's the deeper truth: systems that cannot be influenced are not the problem. The problem is the unwillingness to accept a multipolar world. The global system was designed for centralization, but India's rise is not fitting into that design. It is building parallel systems, alternative trade routes, indigenous technology stacks, and those systems don't need permission. They just need performance. And that performance is beginning to speak. Indian companies are not only growing, they are thriving without foreign influence. They are attracting global users, penetrating competitive markets, scaling without Silicon Valley, and innovating on problems unique to the global South. This is not just business. It's a new model of sovereignty, and sovereignty that resists influence is the ultimate threat to those who seek control. Because if one country proves it can rise without being molded by existing powers, others will follow. Influence, once lost in one region, can cascade across continents. And that cascade is what the global system fears most. Not India's apps, not its hardware, not its AI, but the idea that a nation can succeed on its own terms. This is why the narrative around Indian success is so often twisted. It is not framed as brilliance, but as unpredictability, not as excellence, but as instability. The world has always praised Indian talent when it was exported. But when that same talent stays in India, builds in India, scales from India, and refuses to be filtered through foreign influence, the tone shifts. The applause turns into suspicion. Because the world is not just watching a rising market. It is witnessing a rising mindset. And mindsets are harder to control than machines. India is becoming difficult to influence because it is no longer asking to be included. It is leading in its own lane. It's setting standards, not just following them. It's creating capital, not just receiving it. It's building trust with nations that don't share the Western worldview. It's engaging with new alliances, redefining supply chains, and offering digital infrastructure that does not require Western gatekeeping. That level of self-direction is rare, and it is what makes Indian companies targets, not because of what they are doing wrong, but because of what they are doing right. So remember this: the bans are not about danger, they are about distance. Distance from influence, distance from dependence, distance from vulnerability, and that distance is not a flaw, it is the future, because the new world will not be led by those who are easy to influence. It will be led by those who can remain independent while still being globally relevant. Indian companies are walking that tightrope, strong, steady, unshaken, and in that balance lies their greatest power, not just to succeed, but to inspire others to rise on their own terms, in their own language, and under their own flag. That is what the world fears, not India's growth, but its independence.